Good afternoon, gents. I again hope all to be good. So now, gents, I hope you are pushing, you are doing as much as you possibly can. And I hope you guys are practicing every day. So remember that mathematics is a doing subject. So you essentially have to apply yourselves. So now, gents, I want us to continue with functions. And I want us to start off with the hyperbola function. So now remember that the hyperbola function will have this general form over here. So I'll just highlight it with the red pen, or rather with the red ink. So I'll just rewrite this properly. So now the general form itself has a few variables. So now that would be the A. So I'll also just highlight this in blue. That would be the A, the P, as well as the Q. So now I want us to just focus on the effects that these variables have on the function itself. So now the A would be responsible for the stretch. So this would be more of a stretch of the actual graph itself. So now if A is greater than 0, so that's a positive A, then you would have your graph in the first quadrant as well as the third quadrant. So your graph would be something of that sort. If A is much greater than 1, so that would be if A is greater than 1, then you have your graph heading off from the axis itself. So it means that your graph would essentially be going in that direction. So that's what your graph will be going. If A is less than 0, so that would be a negative A. It means that your graph would then be in the second quadrant as well as the third quadrant. And if A is between 0 and 1, you are essentially compressing your graph. So your graph goes closer and closer to the X and Y axis. So it goes in that direction. Same with the first and the third quadrants as well. So that would be the effects of A. P in itself would be the horizontal shift. So you are essentially moving your graph left or right. So you could either move the graph to the left if P is greater than 0. So if P is greater than 0, so that's a positive P, then you are moving your graph or shifting your graph to the left. If P is greater than, or rather, if P is less than 0, so that's a negative P, you are therefore shifting your graph to the right. So P would be a horizontal shift. Q, on the other hand, would be a vertical shift. If Q is greater than 0, you are shifting your graph upwards. So remember that greater than 0 just means that Q is positive. If Q is less than 0, so that's a negative Q, you are therefore shifting your graph downwards. So that would be a downward shift of the graph. P and Q also have use. So now P would be the vertical asymptote. So that would be the value that the graph itself cannot reach. If you were to look at this, I want to just make you aware of the X plus P. If X plus P equals 0, then you have an undefined graph. So X plus P cannot equal 0. So for X plus P to equal 0, X has to equal negative p. So that would be based on what we actually have here as the general solution, or rather as the general form of the equation. So it means that P in itself is the vertical asymptote. Q, on the other hand, would be the horizontal asymptote. So that would be the value that the graph itself cannot be, or the point that the graph cannot touch. So it means that the equation of the of your horizontal asymptote would be y equals q. So now that in itself would be the equations of the asymptotes. So these over there are the equations of the asymptotes themselves. So now, gents, that's what I wanted to quickly touch up on. I now want us to shift to the questions. So I have a few questions that I want us to try. So now, gents, given y equals 2 divided by x minus 5 plus 4. So we've already determined that this equation over here would be hyperbola. 1.1 wants us to write down the equations of the asymptotes. So now to do so, we know that the vertical asymptote, which would be the x, would equal, so that's 1.1. Or rather, let me just move on to the next page for this. So I'm going to just move on to the next page so that we have a good look at this. So again, just to remind you, the equation would be y equals 2 divided by x minus 5 plus 4. Just to make sure that I've copied it down properly. So now the first question again wants us to write down the equations of the asymptotes. So we already know that the 4 over there would be the y equals 4. So that in itself would be the horizontal asymptote. So that's the horizontal asymptote over there. The x, or rather the vertical asymptote, would be the number that would make this whole equation to equal 0. So if x equals 5 in this equation over there, or rather in this portion here, then you essentially will be dividing by 0. Or rather, if you want to find the vertical asymptote quicker, you only just need to equate the denominator to 0 and then solve for x. So it means that the vertical asymptote would be equal to 5. Let me just use a different color there. So that would be just being consistent. So the vertical asymptote would be equal to 5. So remember that these are values that the graph itself cannot be. Now let's also just have a look at 1.2. 1.2 wants us to determine the x-intercept. So remember that to determine the x-intercept, we have to let y to equal 0. So now we will then have let y equal 0 for the x-intercept. So this would give us 0 equals 2 divided by x minus 5 plus 4. We will move the 4 to the left-hand side. So that would be negative 4, 2 divided by x minus the 5. We can then cross multiply. So this would then give us a negative 4 bracket x minus 5, which would equal 2. We can then multiply in. So this would then be negative 4x plus 20, which would equal 2. We can move the 20 to the right-hand side. This would then give us a 2 minus 20, which would then be negative 4x, which would equal negative 18. To solve for x, we divide throughout by the negative 4, and we should then end up with x equals 18 divided by 4, which simplifies to a 9 divided by 2, which further simplifies to a 4 whole number, 1 divided by 2. So the coordinates of the x-intercept would then be 4 whole number, 1 divided by 2 is to 0. So now let's also just have a look at 1.3. 1.3 wants us to determine the y-intercept. To determine the y-intercept, we would let the x equal 0. So let's just move on to the next page for that. So I'll just 1.3, we will let the x to equal 0. So remember, just to remind you of the equation, so that would be the equation there. So we can then let the x equal 0 plus 4. This would then give us a negative 2 divided by 5 plus 4, which we can use a calculator to give us a value of. Just give me a second on this. So this would then give us 1 second on the value itself. So this would actually give us an 18 divided by 5. And this would further simplify to a 3 whole number, 3 divided by 5, which we can write in coordinate form as 0 is to 3 whole number, 3 divided by 5. So now, gentlemen, that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. Please do have a look at it, and please attempt the questions that do follow. A good day to all.